In this video, we'll look at how to implement the CQRS pattern in your web API. Also, we'll be using the .NET Mediator package in conjunction with the CQRS pattern. But first, what is CQRS? The Command Query Responsibility Segregation pattern, as the name implies, separates the commands from the queries. The commands are everything that changes or writes to a system, for example, the add, update, and delete methods, while the queries are everything that reads from a system, like a getAll or getById method. This pattern is often used in very large complex systems where read and write operations need to be optimized independently. This separation of concerns leads to better maintainability and scalability. How does Mediator fit into this? In a large complex system, many objects communicate with each other. For example, API and service objects can call other API and service objects. A mediator behaves like a messaging system between these objects. For example, an API could send a request to the mediator, which in turn will execute the appropriate method in another API or service and respond with the result. This way, the mediator reduces dependencies between objects. Before we implement the CQRS pattern, we'll start with a normal web API application that uses a clean architecture. If you're interested in learning how to create a clean architecture, you can follow the video link in the description below. For now, let's have a brief look at what we're starting with. In the domain layer, we have one entity or model called student with an ID, student name, full name, and gender property. In the infrastructure layer, we have a student repository interface that declares two methods, a getAllStudents and addStudent method. We implement these methods in the student repository class. Notice we're using a static list here to simulate a persistent database. In the application layer, we have a data transfer object, which is just a reduced version of the student model. There's a student service interface with two methods. Notice the getAllStudents method returns a list of DTOs instead of the original student model. Then we implement the interface in the student service class. The getAllStudents method takes the students retrieved from the repository and converts them to a list of student DTOs. In the presentation layer, or actual API, we have a controller with a get and post endpoint that calls the methods in the service. So that's basically what we start with, an API with one command and one query method. We'll start by installing the Mediator NuGet package into our API project. Our controller endpoints will send all requests to the mediator instead of calling different methods on multiple services. The mediator will handle the request and return the appropriate response. In the program CS file, we register the mediator and configure it to operate in this program assembly. We still need to keep the student repository service to retrieve data from our database. In the solution, we removed the application project and instead created an application folder inside the API project. This is because the commands and queries need to be in the same assembly where the mediator is registered. Also, in the infrastructure layer, we changed the repository methods to asynchronous methods and changed the addStudent method to return the ID of the added student. With that set up, we can start on our commands and queries. In the application folder of our API project, we added three folders, the commands, DTO, and queries folder. In the DTO folder, we still have the reduced version of the student entity as our data transfer object. Let's start on our commands. We'll add two classes, one for the command itself that will represent the request send to the mediator, and a command handler class that will implement the actual code of the command. In case you were wondering, you can add all your commands and their handler classes into one CS file if that better suits your requirements. The addStudent command is a record and takes a student model as argument. It inherits from iRequest. This is what adds this command to the mediator as a request. In the angle brackets, we specify the type of the response that will be returned. The handler class for this command inherits from iRequestHandler. In the angle brackets, we specify the request name and its return type. Then we inject our repository since we need to access the student data. The handle method will implement the code to execute the command and takes a command request and cancellation token as argument. Now we can do the normal repository work. Notice we use the student value passed by the request. Onto the query. You'll notice it follows the same pattern as the command. Here we add this query as a request to the mediator, and it will return a list of student DTOs. The handler class again inherits from iRequestHandler and takes the query request and its return type. Again, we have a handle method that takes the query request and a cancellation token. Then we simply implement the code for the query as you would normally. In this case, we convert the list of students from the repository to a list of DTOs. And that's how we create a separate command and query request for our mediator. Let's see how our controller will use this. The controller will now reference our commands and queries, and of course the mediator. It no longer needs to reference services or data context, for example, because our commands and queries already covers all of that. Now, instead of injecting one or more services into our controller, we only need to inject the sender. This already simplifies our controller code. In our getAllStudents endpoint, we will use the sender to send the query to the mediator. And if you had any parameters here, you can just pass those arguments into query you instantiate. The command endpoint is even simpler. It will receive the command we created to add a student, and we can simply send the command to the mediator. Let's run this and see if our API still works. The get endpoint returns a list of student DTOs, and our post endpoint adds a student and responds with the student's ID. That is our CQRS in a nutshell. But please note, you can also extend your mediator to handle validations and exceptions. Thank you for watching our video. For more tutorials on C#, hit subscribe and click the reminder. Give us a like so the video can be visible to more people.